Okay, we're going to get into your second video now, dealing with argument. And you're going to want to go to your textbook. And this is dealing with pages 33, 34, 35, all the way through, I think, 40 or even further than that. But if you go to your textbook and you start reading those pages there, it's also going to help you understand a lot of this. And we're also going to be using a couple pages, pages 34 and 35, as I go through this video here, to help explain some important parts of it. So have that with you as you're watching the video so that you can kind of keep up and understand what we're going to talk about. All right, what we did over the first video is I talked to you about what an argument is. It has to have three things. It must have the proposition, the premise, and then the conclusion. Next, we're going to get into what are the different types of arguments. And there's two types. There's deductive and inductive reasoning are the two main types of arguments then that in philosophy that we deal with. When we're talking about deductive reasoning then, deductive reasoning is a argument that is supposed to give logically conclusive support to its conclusion. Whereas inductive or non-deductive reasoning is one that is supposed to give probable support. So those are your two key terms there. That's going to be important to make the difference between what is deductive and inductive reasoning. Deductive has to be conclusive, and inductive can be probable in its reasoning. It doesn't have to show conclusiveness to it. All right, so dealing with deductive reasoning first, that's what we're going to look at here first. When you have a successful deductive reasoning, it's going to give a valid argument to the conclusion of it. If it does not, okay, then it's going to be what's termed as invalid in its conclusive, and it's not going to be logical, and the argument is not going to have any substance to it. So it must be valid in its premises in order for its conclusion to also be valid then. If the premises are true, okay, then the conclusion cannot be false. Now, here's something that you have to be very careful about though, is that the guarantee means in deductive valid statements are truth preserving. What that's talking about there is that something that is valid, and a valid argument in philosophy does not mean necessarily factually true. It only means theoretically true, and that's very important, because as we get into some of these different arguments and start getting into the concepts of philosophy deeper here, we'll come across a lot of these arguments in which the premises themselves may not be actually factually true, but they may be theoretically true, and so it still could be a valid argument. In order for it to be what's called a sound argument, okay, and that's the next part here, the testing of it must be not just valid, but also factually true for the argument to have both validity and soundness, okay. An argument must be both valid and true of its premises to be sound, so it has to have both parts. So you can make an argument, and it could have some validity to it, but it may not have soundness to it. Okay, and we're going to go through some examples here in a little bit. So when it comes to arguments, basically there's three things that a deductive reasoning argument could have. Okay, it could be valid with unsound premises, meaning non-factually true premises, but still theoretically true. Okay, or it could be invalid with sound premises, or it could be invalid with unsound premises. Okay, one that would be considered to be invalid with unsound premises, those are called fallacies, which we're going to get more into those in class. Inductive reasoning then would be invalid with sound premises. Would be an example of probably an inductive reasoning then. So it could be factually true statements, but they're not going to be valid statements in terms of their theory. Okay, so let's look at some examples to kind of help get this understood there a little bit better. First one here, and again, these are in your textbook. You can kind of follow along. Socrates is a man. Okay, all men are mortal. Socrates is mortal. Okay, the first two here are premises. These are reasonings of your argument. The first one, Socrates is a man. Okay, well, Socrates could be actually a name of a woman. Okay, but in this case, the reason why this is a valid argument is because even though it may not be sound, okay, Socrates may actually be female. We don't know that right now. All we do know is we're taking for a theory that Socrates is a man. The second one, all men are mortal. Okay, again, that one we know to be not just valid, but we also know this one to be sound statement, a factually true statement. So then Socrates is also mortal. Okay, the first two premises have validity to them. That means that they are theoretically they are truthful. So if these are truthful as far as their theory goes, then the conclusion would also have to follow as being truthful and correctly as well. Now, is this a sound argument? Well, if we'd go back and check and we'd look up and find out, yeah, Socrates was actually a man. We know that all men are mortal. Socrates is mortal. So this would be both valid and sound. The second one, if Mary is sneezing, she has a cold. Mary is not sneezing. Mary does not have a cold. Well, this is an invalid statement, okay? And the reason why it's invalid is because basically the premises don't follow, or they fail to follow into the conclusion then. Okay? Mary is sneezing, she has a cold. Okay, well, that could be a valid statement in itself, but we know that's not true because you could sneeze and have different reasons for your sneezing to have the cold. But as far as the validity of it goes, okay, the first statement, and then you follow that with the second statement, Mary is not sneezing, so therefore she does not have a cold. The conclusion doesn't follow the other two premises then. It doesn't kind of go in a sequence of A, B, C. You're kind of jumping around making assumptions of the two to get the conclusion, so there is no direct connection between it. If there's no direct connection between the premises and the conclusion, it cannot be a valid statement then. Okay, so that's why it doesn't follow into that. Um, if you would say, if Mary is sneezing, she has a cold, and then the second statement here is, Mary does not have a cold, then the conclusion then, Mary is not sneezing, would have more validity to it. It may not be sound, but it would be valid, okay, because then it follows a good format. Because this does not, it would be an invalid statement then. All right, another one is, if the atomic number of hydrogen is 1, then it is the lightest element. The atomic number of hydrogen is 1, hydrogen is the lightest element. Now let's look at the next one. If the atomic number of helium is 1, then it is the lightest element. The atomic number of helium is 1, helium is the lightest element. Okay, they're both exactly the same arguments. One, okay, however, is going to be sound. The other one is going to be unsound. They're both valid in their theory. But next, remember, in order for an argument to be both valid and sound, not only does it have to be theoretically true, it has to be actually true. Well, in this case, it's not, and because helium is not, its atomic number is not 1. And so once you would go look that up and find out that helium's atomic number is actually different, then that would throw this out as being a sound argument. Okay, it's still valid because theoretically, if helium's atomic number was 1 and is and number 1 would be the lightest element, then yeah, it would theoretically work. So even though you could have an argument that is false in its truthfulness, it still could be true in its theoreticalness. And that's what makes it a little bit difficult when it comes to philosophy and arguments then. Okay, so kind of keep that in mind. Another thing you have to keep in mind about when it comes to philosophical arguments has to do with timing. Okay, so for example, if today is Tuesday, then tomorrow is Wednesday. My second premise is that today is Tuesday. So then tomorrow is Wednesday. However, this is only going to work, this argument, if in actual truth today was Tuesday. If today was actually Thursday, then this would not work because tomorrow would not be Wednesday, it would actually be Friday. So theoretically, it's a valid statement because it is true in that following the sequence, but it is unsound in its actual truthfulness then. Okay, so when it comes to the different forms of deductive reasoning, then there are basically, four types that you're going to want to know for your test. Okay, modus ponens, modus tollens, disconjunctive syllogism, and reduction ad absurdum. Now, these are all in your textbook, okay, and they give examples in your textbook on page 35 and 34 and 35 of each one of these. Make sure you kind of look at those and go through them. Modus ponens there, I'm just going to kind of go with your textbook here to explain this one. When it has modus ponens, then the sequence of it in the textbook would be if P, then Q. So the second premise is P, so then the third premise would have to follow, then it would have to be Q. An example of that, again, going back to, this idea of Donald Trump's that he came up with. Okay, so my example would be if we ban all Muslims, then no more terrorism. So that would be if P, then Q. The P is the Muslims, the Q would be no more terrorism. The second premise is we ban the Muslims. So that's premise P. Q then would be no more terrorism. So that would be a valid statement or argument to make. Is it sound? No. Because the fact that the first statement of itself is that we ban all Muslims, no more terrorism. Well, there are other terrorist groups out there that are not Muslim, that are non-Muslim in their religion. So that would be an unsound statement, but it would still be a valid statement. Okay, so now the second one, modus tollens, is the denying of the consequent. Okay, the first one, remember, is affirming it. So I was saying if one, then the other must follow. So if P, then Q. Now, on modus tollens, you're denying the second part of the argument. So if P, then Q, the second premise, not Q, so then it cannot be P. And again, this is in your textbook. So here's my example. If we ban all Muslims, no more terrorism. Okay, that's the same as what the first one was. Not Q now, this is the denying part. Terrorism does not stop. Then we should not ban all Muslims. So the fact that not Q, because the second premise was not truthful, there would be no more terrorism. That was the first part of the premise. The second premise then said that terrorism did not stop, so therefore we should not ban all Muslims because it does not work. There again would be a not just a valid statement, but now this one would become a sound statement as well. Okay, the third one is a disjunctive syllogism. This is when you're denying the disjunction. Okay, in other words, in your textbook it says either P or Q. If not Q, then it must be P. So disjunctive syllogism is basically arguing that it has to be one or the other. There has to be a choice. So here's an example. Either Muslims are peaceful or they are terrorists. Second premise, they are not terrorists, so not Q, so therefore they would have to be P, which is they are peaceful. Okay. Now again, this could be, you could argue that that's an unsound argument because you could find factual evidence to go against it, but it is logical in its argument because it is valid in the following of its premises to the conclusion then. Okay. The last one, reduction to a contradiction then, is also in your textbook then, and basically it gets into this argument dealing with, you assume A is a logical opposite of the conclusion you seek to prove. Logically, you deduce a contradiction from A. This proves A is false since a contradiction cannot be true. Okay, and again, your textbook kind of gives some examples of that. For example, in your textbook, it goes over several different types of examples dealing with some of these, and you can just kind of read through that and get those then. That's going to finish up our second presentation, and then we have a third one that we'll get into later.